You've been doing banded external rotations, but your shoulder still hurts in pull-ups or dips. That's not because your rotator cuff is weak, it's because you are training muscle action instead of muscle function. The rotator cuff is not a movement muscle, it's a control system. But what do I mean with that? So if we're looking at the isolated action of a muscle, in this case of the rotator cuff, it has a couple of functions. External rotation, internal rotation, and small amounts of abduction. But if we look at the function of the rotator cuff, so how it's integrated into the whole system, the job of the rotator cuff is to keep the humerus, so the upper arm bone, centered in the shoulder joint socket, while other prime movers create or withstand force. The rotator cuff is not here to impress with range of motion. It's here to keep the joint congruent under load. But what does congruent mean? It ensures smooth gliding. The structures are moving as they're intended on the platform they need. I suppose you've been working on improving your shoulder external rotation, whether that was with banded external rotations at 90 degrees of abduction or at the side of the torso in a lying position. And yeah, I assume you didn't make real progress, right, in terms of improving your external rotation range. And the reason why most of this rotator cuff work fails in the first place is because people tend to assume the shoulder joint is the whole thing, but there is a little bit more nuance to it. The rotator cuff depends on a few things. The scapula as a platform, the ribcage as the surface where the scapula has to move on, scapular mechanics that create space and alignment. Only if you respect these three, you will improve shoulder external rotation. So you can strengthen external rotation in a clean setup. And then you go back to pull-ups and dips. And the shoulder still feels unstable and pingy, but because the platform probably is still dysfunctional. Now let's talk about the missing piece. Scapular mechanics and scapular plane. The scapula is not fixed. It must move with the humerus. The humerus is our upper arm bone, and the upper arm bone is directly connected to the scapula. And the scapula sits on top of the ribcage. And there needs to be congruence, there needs to be contact in between those two so that the scapula can glide nicely on the ribcage. That means the scapula needs to stay wrapped around the ribcage. No winging and no sliding off. When we allow for smooth congruence for the scapula on the ribcage, we'll get proper upward rotation and posterior tilt of the scapula. And this is very, very important as we go through the shoulder flexion arc. That means as we raise the arm overhead, the scapula needs to orientate with the upper arm. So we will see some upward rotation and then some posterior tipping. Posterior tipping, the top border of the scapula going away from the ribcage, and this will put the glenoid fossa, so that's the socket of the shoulder joint, that will be orientated in a way where we can reach overhead. And then that final tipping at the end of the shoulder flexion range will ensure that we get that last part of shoulder flexion. Another thing that we need to consider is the scapular plane. The shoulder works best when motion lines up with how the scapula sits on the ribcage. But what does that mean? So for example, if we're having someone with a hunched upper back, those rounded shoulders, the scapula will point more so forward. If we have someone with a flat upper back, the scapula will point more out to the side. And therefore, the ribcage position dictates our scapular plane. And that should be something that we keep in mind, especially when it comes to rotator cuff training. And the biggest key takeaway from this now is, if the scapula does not move, the rotator cuff has to compensate for it. Now let's talk about the secret superstar when it comes to smooth gliding and nice congruence of the scapula on the ribcage, the serratus anterior. The serratus is the scapular's anchor and guide on the ribcage. If the serratus underperforms, Scap upward rotation will be limited. Posterior tipping of the shoulder blade will be limited, and as a result, congruence between the scapula and the ribcage will be restricted as well, because the main job of the serratus is to wrap the scap around the ribcage. And if that's the case, then the rotator cuff becomes a constant stabilizer under bad alignment. That is not strength, that is survival. Let's look at a few examples, and let's start with pull-ups. In pull-ups, people tend to lock their scaps back and down and call it packed. That looks strong, but often it limits upward rotation and scapular movement on the ribcage. As a result, we'll see the following things. Humeral head control gets a lot harder, so that shows up in things like elbows flaring out on the lift-off on a pull-up, right? Ideally, we like to see the elbows almost perpendicular under the wrist, but if they flare early, the shoulder tends to elevate. This is usually a sign that there is very little congruence of the scapula on the ribcage, and usually that leads to the cuff becoming kind of a break, right? It limits our force output. And that obviously results in the shoulder feeling cranky. You'll feel that nagging discomfort and so on. But this is not a sign that your rotator cuff is weak, just a sign that your scapula is stuck. When it comes to dips, people tend to chase depression really hard at the bottom of the movement. This results in the ribs flaring, the scap anteriorly tilting, and now the front of the shoulder taking the bill for it. And this results in the following things. As we flare the ribs at the bottom of the movement, we lose the congruence between the scapula and the ribcage. And this again leads to the rotator cuff needing to overwork to stabilize because the shoulder being out of alignment, which leads to that pinchy pain in the front of the shoulder. In most cases, you don't need more rotator cuff work or more external rotation work. You need a scapula that sits on your ribcage. Here is what you do instead. We're going to fix the system with the following progression logic. First, we're going to restore scap movement. Then we're building serratus strength and control before we load the cuff in the right positions. If the scapula has no surface, the rotator cuff has no socket. This is why we're not starting with rotator cuff exercises. Instead, we're starting with creating congruence. Step 1, get the ribcage back under the scapula. For this first step, we're using a low-level exercise, simply because we want to drive mobility through the ribs, and we can do that by breathing in and out, because that creates expansion and compression of the ribcage and creates the congruence between the scapula and the ribcage. And for this particular step, we're going to use a seated posterior expansion breathing drill, where we're going to reach our elbows forward, expand the upper back, and nicely breathe into that upper back area, ensuring we bring the ribcage closer to the scapula. Things to look for with this exercise is to ensure we're having a long and tall spine, we're not overly hunched in the upper back and losing height in the skeleton. We want to feel both sit bones. This ensures we are putting the pelvis into a position where we can create a nice stack between the ribcage and the pelvis. And this is what will ensure that the ribcage is properly positioned to create the platform for the scapula to glide on it. Now the next step is to work on upward rotation of the scapula. For this particular step, I like to use two different exercises. Either a cable single arm front raise or a landmine press. And the biggest cue for both of these exercises is press or raise the arm with the scapula, not without it. So ensure there is smooth gliding throughout the whole exercise. To ensure you can do that, you want to aim for a tall and long spine. If you are arching your back, overly hunching your back, you won't get the benefit out of these exercises. Let's continue with the third step, the missing link for most of you, integrated calf function. This is actually where the money really is. And here we're going to use an exercise like a kettlebell bottom under press. This one is a really good one and it belongs here because it demands humeral head control. So the actual function of the rotator cuff, its actual job, right? Remember, we differentiate between muscle action and muscle function. And the job of the rotator cuff is to stabilize the humeral head in the shoulder joint socket, especially during movements and under load. And that's what is happening during the kettlebell bottom under press. But the kettlebell bottom under press is an amazing exercise for several reasons. First of all, we're working on upward rotation of the scapula. The serratus is working during upward rotation. It creates congruence of the scapula on the ribcage. And as we rotate the scapula upward, the scapula puts the glenoid fossa into the right direction so the arm can go overhead in a compensation-free manner. And this is how you actually train the rotator cuff. Now, obviously, the last step is to integrate it back into pull-ups and dips. When it comes to pull-ups, there are a few non-negotiables. Let your scap move, ribs stay quiet and down, don't overly flare them, and avoid a constant depression strategy. When it comes to dips, there are a few goals you should keep in mind. Learn controlled scap movement, teach congruence without forcing depression, earn the bottom position without crashing into it. If your pull-ups and dips keep irritating your shoulders, stop collecting rotator cuff exercises. Fix the platform and then the rotator cuff can do its real job. That's a wrap for today's video, and if you haven't done yet, please help me grow this channel by subscribing, liking and turning notifications on so you don't miss out on any new video. And if you need help with your own training and you're looking for help, guidance, then reach out for my one-on-one online coaching. The link for the waitlist is down in the description. If you want to know how we work, then subscribe to my newsletter for more insights, and see you in the next one.